The crossroads was a place where light went to die and be reborn as something cheaper. Neon bled across the docking bay in streaks of chemical green and bruised violet, pooling on the wet deck plates and running in rivulets toward the drainage grates. Elara Vant stood at the edge of a maintenance platform, her hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the traffic. Freight haulers from a dozen species rumbled overhead, their iron wash stirring the humid air into greasy swirls. The smell was always the same here: hot metal, recycled oxygen, and the faint, sweet rot of alien waste processed through inadequate scrubbers. She had been a broker for 23 years, long enough to know that hope was a commodity that depreciated faster than any physical good. Her contact arrived precisely on schedule, which meant the Keth were desperate. They were never punctual when they had options. Grell moved through the crowd. He was humanoid in the way most galactic species were, bipedal with 2 arms and a head, but the similarities ended there. His skin was a mosaic of interlocking silicate plates. Each plate was etched with fine lines that recorded his family history. The plates clicked softly as he walked, a sound like distant rain on stone. He stopped before her and dipped his head. The gesture was formal, almost ceremonial. "Broker Vant," he said. His voice was dry, cracked, the voice of someone who had been breathing dust for too long. "Grell," she replied. She kept her tone neutral. "You said you had data." He produced a datapad from a fold in his tunic. The device was old, its casing scarred by heat and pressure. He held it out to her with both hands. She took it and activated the display. The image that bloomed before her was not high definition. It was grainy, captured on a cheap sensor array, but it was clear enough. A dark shape hovered above a Keth worker in what looked like a processing tunnel. It was a toll collector, a silhouette of condensed darkness that seemed to drink the light around it, leaving a faint afterimage on the retina. It had no discernible limbs, no face, no points of reference. It was simply a void where a being should have been. The worker was on his knees. His silicate plates were dull, the family lines on his skin faded to near invisibility. A thin filament of dark energy connected his temple to the collector's core. The worker's mouth was open, but no sound came out. His eyes were fixed on something that wasn't there. The recording lasted 11 seconds. When it ended, the worker collapsed. His body hit the deck with a wet, brittle sound. The collector drifted away, its business concluded. Elara handed the datapad back to Grell. She said nothing. "That was my cousin," Grell said. His plates clicked once, a sound like a snapped twig. "He is still alive, he breathes, he eats if we put food in his mouth, but the part of him that was my cousin is gone. The Darkweave took it." Elara held her silence. The Darkweave, she knew the name. They were a guild of psionic beings who treated consciousness as a currency, and their toll collectors were infamous. She had seen worse. She had brokered deals between species that regarded each other as food sources. She had mediated disputes for the Sporewind. They were a fungal species whose nurseries smelled of wet earth and ozone. She had salvaged technology from a null entity. These silent beings of pure mathematics left behind cold voids where their ships had been. Their method of travel was the dimensional fold. It was a violent process that tore temporary holes in reality. She had even sat across a table from a paradox representative. The temporal agents flickered between timelines, speaking in sentences that began before she was born. The galaxy was a vast machine designed to produce suffering. Her job was to oil the gears. But this was bad. This was the kind of bad that turned into worse if nobody found a lever to pull. "You have something to trade," she said. It was not a question. Grell's plates clicked again, faster this time, nervous. "We have coordinates, a derelict vessel. The readings are strange. Our analysts believe it is null entity in origin. A ghost ship made of forgotten math. That was valuable. A salvageable hull could fund a Keth colony for generations." "Why not sell it yourselves?" Elara asked. "Because the Darkweave would intercept the transaction," Grell said. "They monitor all our communications. They would take the coordinates and give us nothing. We need a neutral party. We need a broker." She nodded. That was why she was here. But she knew, even as she agreed to take the case, that the Keth were offering the one thing they could not afford to lose. They were betting their future on a broker's skill. And Elara had seen too many futures collapse under the weight of a bad bet. She dismissed Grell with a formal promise to review the data and send a response within 12 standard hours. He left the way he had come, moving through the crowd with that same careful economy, a man carrying a burden that was slowly crushing him. Elara did not go to her office. She went to her quarters, a small cabin in the residential ring of the crossroads, where the light was dimmer and the noise of the bazaar faded to a distant hum. She sat at her terminal and accessed a sealed archive. It was a personal legacy passed down through her family for generations. The data was stored on a crystalline substrate. The lattice of silicon held information within its very molecular structure, predating most modern encryption. She scrolled past standard schematics to a familiar entry, the thought amplifier. It was a common device used across the galaxy for diplomatic negotiations. The machine broadcast a user's thoughts in a focused beam, allowing for direct mental contact across distances. The archive described another configuration. It was labeled in her grandmother's handwriting, a looping script that had been digitized but never sanitized. The label read, "Feedback Cascade." Elara read the description. She read it twice. The words were clinical, but the implications were not. The feedback cascade did not amplify thoughts. It reflected them. It took a signal and bounced it back at the source, multiplied by every node in the network, creating a recursive loop that grew exponentially with each cycle. It was designed for communication, but it could be used for something else entirely. She closed the archive. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. She had spent her entire career building a reputation as a neutral party, a woman who could be trusted to find a solution that did not involve bloodshed. The feedback cascade was not a solution. It was a bomb. She composed a formal request for parley. The message was short, professional, and utterly without emotion. She addressed it to the Darkweave factor in system, a being known only as Keth. The reply came within the hour. A single cold pulse of data, a meeting time, a location. Deep in the industrial spires, where the light never reached. Elara stared at the coordinates for a long moment. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and walked out into the neon-smeared dark. The dark flow was a river of whispered intentions. It was a luminous network beneath reality, connecting all things. Keth drifted through it. Its consciousness was spread thin across the threads that linked every mind in the sector. Here, in the space between spaces, the crossroads above was nothing but a constellation of bright knots. Each one a mind, a vessel, a transaction waiting to happen. The human broker's request had arrived through the proper channels. It was a ripple in the dark flow that Keth had plucked and examined with casual disinterest. The Keth were a resource. Their psionic output was modest, yes, but steady, a low, constant mental hum that could be harvested. That harvested energy fed their dimensional engines. These were devices that folded space to push vessels through the void. The ships powered by these engines were called shadow traders. They were Darkweave vessels built for long-haul travel. The tolls were not malice. They were transaction, a fair exchange for passage through territories the Darkweave had claimed and maintained for centuries. Keth unfolded a fragment of its awareness toward the coordinates attached to the request, the null entity derelict. It was a known object, a cold pocket in the dark flow where no thought could reach, a void, worthless. Whatever salvage the Keth believed they had found, they were wrong. This deal would fail. Keth pulsed a command to its physical anchor, and the world inverted. It surfaced from the dark flow into the meeting spire, a tower of black glass and silver veins that rose from the crossroads' central platform. The transition was always jarring, the sudden weight of matter, the crush of linear time, the stink of solid things decaying. The human was already there. Elara Vant stood near the observation window, her reflection a pale ghost against the starfield. She was shorter than most species Keth had negotiated with, her body soft and unarmored. She wore a plain jacket with too many pockets, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she expected no pleasantries. Keth manifested its projection. The form was humanoid, woven from moving shadows and fragments of stolen light. It had no face to speak of, only a shifting darkness where features might have been, but it approximated a head, shoulders, hands clasped in a gesture of patience. Its voice came as a dry rustle, not through the air but directly into the mind. The request has been evaluated. Elara turned. Her eyes were steady, her breathing controlled. She did not flinch at the projection. Keth noted this with a flicker of acknowledgement. Humans were primitive, yes, but they had a disturbing opacity. Their minds were not neatly layered like those of civilized species. They were a chaotic swirl, emotions tangled with memories tangled with contradictions, making psionic scanning difficult and mildly unpleasant. And, she said, The null-entity vessel is known to us, Keth said. It is a void. It holds no value. The Keth have traded you a worthless coordinate. Elara's expression did not change. They believe it has value. That's enough for me to work with. Belief does not alter reality. Belief alters markets. She took a step closer, her boots clicking on the black glass floor. The Keth are desperate. Desperate sellers accept low prices. I can broker a deal that benefits everyone. Kethal let the silence stretch. It had learned that humans often filled silences with useful information. This one did not. She simply waited, her arms crossed, her gaze unblinking. The terms are unchanged, Kethal said finally. Psionic energy willingly given, the Keth will submit to harvesting protocols. In exchange, their vessels may pass through our territories without interference. If they refuse, their systems will be placed under full embargo, strangled. Elara's jaw tightened. You're talking about draining entire populations. You're talking about turning living beings into batteries. We are talking about transaction, Kethal said. Its projection leaned forward, the shadows around its head rippling like smoke. The Keth use our roots. They benefit from our infrastructure. They must pay. This is not cruelty. This is economics. It's not proportionality, Elara said. You're demanding everything they have, their entire psionic output. That's not a toll. That's annihilation. Kethal felt a pulse of something it did not immediately recognize. Irritation? No, it was more like boredom. The human was arguing from a framework of mercy, of fairness, of moral weight. These were concepts without transactional value. They could not be measured, harvested, or spent. Proportionality is a luxury of the powerful, Kethal said. The Keth are not powerful. They are a resource, and resources do not negotiate terms. Elara's hands unclenched at her sides. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, and Kethal felt the chaotic swirl of her mind shift. Not settle, but organize, she was thinking. Give me time, she said. Let me talk to the Keth. Let me find something else of value. There has to be a middle ground. There is no middle ground, Kethal said. There is the toll, or there is the embargo. Choose. I'm not the one who needs to choose. Kethal's projection flickered. The human was stubborn. This was not a threat. It was an inconvenience. She would fail. The Keth would refuse the terms, the embargo would collapse their economy, and within a standard cycle they would beg for the harvesting protocols. It was inevitable. The meeting is concluded, Kethal said. It began to dissolve, the shadows of its projection unraveling into threads of darkness that spiraled upward and outward. As it slipped back into the dark flow, Kethal issued a command to the nearest shadow trader vessel. The order was simple, clean, unambiguous. A demonstrative action was required. The next Keth freighter to approach the toll zone was to be fully drained, every mind aboard emptied. The ship would arrive at its destination as a hollow shell, a lesson in transit. Dealings with the chaotic factions of the free systems required unambiguous lessons. Kethal submerged into the luminous threads, its awareness expanding once more into the cool, infinite currents of the substrata. The human's face lingered in its memory, not the face itself, but the eyes. Those steady, unblinking eyes that had not looked away. It dismissed the thought. Humans were primitive. Their opacity was not depth. It was chaos, nothing more. The dark flow hummed around Kethal, carrying whispers of 1,000 transactions, 1,000 minds, 1,000 small surrenders. The universe was a ledger. Every debt would be collected. And the human would learn that soon enough. The crossroads had never been silent. Elara Vant stood at the viewing gallery's edge, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and watched the feed that every screen on the station now carried. The Keth pilgrim ship was a small, blunt vessel, its hull etched with the spiral patterns of their faith. It floated in the dark, unarmed, broadcasting its peaceful intentions on all common bands. Then the Darkweave tendrils came. They looked like black lightning, jagged and hungry, stabbing through the hull as if it were wet paper. The ship did not explode. It shuddered once and then went still. But the sound that followed was worse than any explosion. Every open comm channel flooded with the silent scream of 300 minds being siphoned away. Elara had heard many terrible things in 23 years of brokering. She had heard the death rattles of species, the weeping of refugees, the cold logic of executioners. This was different. This was the sound of consciousness being unspooled, thread by thread, until nothing remained but a hollow body. It lasted 7 seconds. Then the ship went dark, adrift, and the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The crossroads erupted, Behind Elara, the main concourse became a chaos of bodies and voices. A spore-winged delegate pushed through the crowd. Its fungal tendrils flared with angry spores as it shouted curses at the Darkweave. Near the information kiosk, two temporal paradox agents shimmered. Their forms flickered through multiple timelines as they debated whether to flee forward or backward. The Keth merchants in the lower stalls were already arming themselves with tools and cargo hooks. Their silicate-plated faces were set in expressions of cold, desperate rage. Elara did not move. She watched the dead ship drift on the screen and she felt something inside her break. Not her composure. That was still intact. Something deeper. Something that had believed against all evidence that she could hold back the tide with words and contracts and carefully balanced deals. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned. Grell stood behind her, his face ashen beneath the silicate plates that normally gleamed with a faint, healthy luster. The plates were dull now, almost gray. He looked like a man who had already been hollowed out. "The deal is dead," he said. His voice was flat, empty. "War is coming, my people will fight, they will be exterminated." Elara opened her mouth to say something professional, something neutral, something a broker should say. The words would not come. "I watched my cousin die that way," Grell continued, staring past her at the screen. "Now 300 more, we have no fleet, no weapons that can touch them, but we will fight anyway because dying is better than being drained like livestock." Elara closed her eyes. She saw the faces of every species she had failed to save over 2 decades. She saw the contracts she had signed, the compromises she had brokered, the slow erosion of her own soul as she told herself that neutrality was a virtue. She opened her eyes. "No," she said. Grell blinked. "No. No, you will not fight, and no, you will not be exterminated." Elara stepped away from the glass. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. "I am no soldier, Grell. I have never fired a weapon. I have never led a charge, but I am a human." She said it like it meant something. She needed it to mean something. "Give me access to your medical bay," she said. "Specifically, your thought amplifier." Grell stared at her. "The amplifier is a healing device. It treats mental trauma. It broadcasts peaceful resonance to calm agitated minds. What possible use could that be now?" "Trust me," she said, her voice firm. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the same desperate hope that a drowning man shows when a hand reaches down. "Follow me," Grell said, his tone resigned. The Keth medical bay was sterile and quiet, lit by soft blue panels that hummed with a low, calming frequency. The thought amplifier sat in the center of the room, a dome of crystalline material no larger than a human head, supported by a slender metal stand. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat made visible. Elara approached it slowly, her eyes scanning every surface, every connection, every component she could see. "How does it work?" she asked. A young Keth technician stepped forward. His name was Thel, and he had been crying. Elara could tell by the salt stains on his silicate plates. He did not try to hide them. "It reads the brain's electrical patterns," Thel said, his voice rough. "Then it broadcasts a harmonic frequency that smooths out trauma responses. It calms panic. It eases grief. It is peaceful. It has never hurt anyone." "Good," Elara said. "That is exactly what I need." She pulled a small data chip from a concealed pocket in her jacket. The chip was ancient, its casing scratched and worn. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, who had belonged to a lineage of engineers who remembered things that most of humanity had forgotten. "What is that?" Thel asked. "My inheritance," Elara said, "and our only chance." She inserted the chip into the amplifier's diagnostic port. The device hummed, flickered, and then displayed a cascade of symbols that Thel had never seen before. He leaned closer, squinting. "What language is that?" "Old Earth, Proto-Indo-European, I think, or something older." Elara's fingers moved across the interface, navigating menus that had been designed before humanity had ever left the solar system. "My family kept archives. We were engineers once, before the regression, before we forgot who we were." She found what she was looking for. A protocol labeled in the dry, clinical language of ancient military scientists as a feedback cascade. It was not a weapon. The file was very clear about that. It was a diagnostic tool designed to test the limits of psionic resonance technology. But any tool can be used in ways its creators never intended. Elara began to modify the amplifier. The feedback cascade takes a thought amplifier and reverses its flow. she explained, her hands steady as she rewired the internal circuits. Instead of broadcasting clarity, it creates a recursive psionic loop. The signal feeds back on itself, amplifying and re-amplifying until it becomes a standing wave of pure consciousness. Thel's eyes widened. That would cause a psionic feedback storm. Anyone connected to the loop would experience 1,000 times the emotional intensity they brought into it. Yes, Elara said. And the Darkweave are psionic creatures. They feel everything. They feed on emotions. They have never experienced a recursive loop before. They have no defense against it. She finished the modifications. The amplifier now hummed with a different tone, sharper, more urgent. She stepped back and looked at Grell. I need a volunteer, she said. Someone connected to the amplifier, and I need a direct, unshielded comm link to the Darkweave toll collector's frequency. I need to send a message. Grell stared at the modified device. What kind of message? The kind they will feel. Thel stepped forward before anyone could speak. His silicate plates were still dull with grief, but his eyes burned. My sister was on that ship, he said. I felt her die. I felt her mind being pulled apart piece by piece while I stood here and did nothing. He walked to the amplifier and placed his hands on the connection points. Use me, use my grief, make them feel it. Elara looked at him. He was young, too young. His whole life stretched ahead of him, and he was volunteering to become a battery for a weapon that might not even work. This will hurt, she said. Good, Thel replied. It should. The dark flow hummed with the clean, transactionless silence Kethal preferred. Around it, the lesser minds of the crossroads thrashed in their predictable patterns of grief and rage. It monitored the chaos with something approaching satisfaction. The lesson had been administered. 300 Keth minds, drained in a single, elegant motion, had broadcast fear across every channel in the sector. The primitive factions were loud. They would not unite. They were too chaotic, too driven by the inefficient noise of emotion. Let them scream. Let them threaten. In 3 cycles, they would accept whatever terms it offered because the alternative was the same silence that had swallowed the pilgrims. Kethal prepared to dissolve its connection to the meeting spire. The human broker had been a momentary curiosity, nothing more. She had argued for time, for mercy, for proportionality. Such concepts had no weight in the ledger of real power. Then the pulse hit. It came through the official toll collector channel, a frequency reserved for formal declarations of compliance or surrender. But this was no request for parley. It was raw, unfiltered agony, the dying mental echo of the Keth pilgrim, amplified 1,000-fold and focused into a single, searing beam of pure emotional memory. Kethal's projection flickered. The pain was insignificant as energy. A child could have absorbed the wattage without strain. But as data, as experience, it was a corrosive shock. The memory of 300 minds being pulled apart, their essences siphoned into the void, their final moments of terror compressed into a single, unbearable instant. It crashed through Kethal's consciousness like a wave of acid. For a species that viewed emotion as inefficient noise, this burst was an assault on coherence itself. Kethal's thoughts stuttered. The clean streams of transactional logic that governed its existence were suddenly polluted by something it had no framework to process. A mother's scream for a child she would never see again. A merchant's last, frantic calculation of debts left unpaid. A pilot's regret for a journey she should never have taken. Meaningless, all of it meaningless. And yet the data refused to be dismissed. It lingered, a splinter of irrationality lodged in the smooth machinery of Kethal's mind. Across the Darkflow network, it felt the same disturbance ripple outward. Other collectors reported similar bursts of targeted, painful psychic noise. They were not attacks that damaged ships. They did not breach hulls or sever power conduits, but they disrupted focus. They polluted the clean streams of transactional thought. They made it impossible to concentrate on the simple, beautiful logic of exchange. Kethal's projection solidified, then wavered again as another pulse struck. This one was different. This one carried a signature, not Keth, not any of the other primitive species that haunted the crossroads. This was the human broker, Elara Vant. Her emotional imprint was woven through the attack like a thread of poison, unmistakable and infuriating. The human was the source. Kethal felt the first stirring of something unfamiliar. It was not irritation born of transactional inconvenience, the minor annoyance of a deal gone sour. This was deeper. It was personal. The human had taken a tool of healing, a thought amplifier, designed to calm and soothe, and weaponized it. She had turned a device meant to ease suffering into a delivery system for suffering itself. She had taken the agony of her allies and used it as ammunition. It was illogical. It was creative. It was a perversion of purpose so profound that Keth could not find a category for it in its understanding of rational behavior. The human had no ships, she had no weapons, she had no leverage, and yet she had found a way to wound the Darkweave network not through force but through meaning. That was dangerous. Keth dispatched an order through the Darkflow, not a toll collector. Those vessels were designed for extraction, for the clean, systematic harvesting of psionic energy. They were not suited for retrieval. Instead, it sent a containment unit. The ship was small, armored in shadow stuff, crewed by a single pilot whose consciousness was linked directly to Kethal's own. The unit's orders were precise. Locate the human broker, retrieve her and the modified device, and return them to the Darkweave spire for analysis. The containment unit slipped through the Darkflow. Its trajectory was a perfect arc that would bring it into the crossroads, medical bay within moments. Kethal watched its progress through the network. The pulses of amplified agony continued, but they were weaker now. The human's device was losing coherence, its charge dissipating with each broadcast. She had perhaps 3 more transmissions before the thought amplifier burned out completely. 3 more chances to disrupt. 3 more chances to spread her corrosive message of grief and rage. Kethal found itself, for the first time in centuries, experiencing something it could not quantify. It was not curiosity. It was not respect. It was something closer to recognition, the acknowledgement of a threat that could not be measured in megawatts or trade units. The human was illogical. The human was chaotic. The human was dangerous. And Kethal was going to end her. The containment unit emerged from the Darkflow into the crossroads, medical bay. Its arrival was silent, its form a shifting mass of shadow that seemed to drink the light from the room. The pilot's consciousness reached out, scanning for the human's signature. She was here. She was standing beside the thought amplifier, her hand on its control panel, her face pale but determined. She saw the containment unit. She did not run. Instead, she smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of something Kethal's pilot could not interpret. Not defiance, not resignation, something else. Something that made the pilot hesitate just for a moment. The human spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and utterly without fear. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Kethal, watching through its pilot's eyes, felt that unfamiliar irritation sharpen into something colder. The human had been waiting. She had known they would come. The question was, what else had she planned? The containment unit extended a tendril of shadow stuff, reaching for the human and her device. The pilot was fast, efficient, precise. But the human was faster. She pressed a button on the thought amplifier's control panel. The device did not broadcast another pulse. Instead, it began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to crawl through the air like living thing. The hum grew louder. The light in the room flickered. The containment unit's tendril stopped, hesitated, and then recoiled as if burned. Kethal felt a spike of confusion from its pilot. The shadow stuff was not reacting to energy. It was reacting to something else, something the pilot could not identify. The human's smile widened. "You think I only used this thing to broadcast pain?" she said. "That was just the opening act." The hum became a scream, and the room dissolved into chaos. The medical bay lights failed without warning, plunging the room into a thick emergency gloom. The air itself seemed to tear, a sound like ripping silk that came from everywhere at once. Shadows congealed. 3 Darkweave figures stepped out of the nothing. Their bodies were solid and menacing, wrapped in dampening fields that made the skin on Elara's arms prickle. The fields were designed to suppress any psionic output within a radius, to make a victim quiet and helpless before the harvest began. Grell froze beside her, his silicate plates clicking against each other in a rapid, terrified rhythm. The Keth technician lay slumped at the console, unconscious, his body limp. The feedback loop had protected his mind by shunting the amplified pain outward, but it had left him empty, a discarded shell. Elara did not think, she moved. Her hand shot out and grabbed the psionic battery powering the thought amplifier. It was a crystalline sphere, warm to the touch, pulsing with a soft, internal light. The device was designed to store consented mental energy, to hold the calm and focus of a willing mind for healing purposes. It was a tool of peace. She hurled it at the feet of the lead Darkweave. The sphere shattered against the floor. The released energy, already charged with the amplified grief frequency from the 300 dead Keth, exploded not as light, but as a concussive wave. The wave was pure psionic static, a scream made of needles that passed through Elara's body. The room buckled. She felt it in her bones. The Darkweave forms shuddered. Their precise geometric shadows blurred at the edges, wavering like heat mirages. They were not hurt. Their bodies were constructs of folded space, not flesh. But the psychic cacophony scrambled their connection to the darkflow. Severed from that dimension, they could not remain in normal space. They were disoriented. They were blind for a single precious second. Elara shoved Grell toward the door. Her other hand snatched the core of the thought amplifier from its housing, a smoking, overloaded brick of fused circuits and burnt-out relays. It was useless now, but it was hers. They ran. The corridor outside was chaos. Keth merchants stumbled past, their faces masks of confusion and terror. Alarms blared from every direction. Elara did not slow down. She knew where she had to go. The only asset left, the only card she still held. The null entity derelict. To the Darkweave it was nothing. A dead void in space, an empty husk with no value. But Elara had spent 23 years as a broker. She had seen the old files, the buried archives, the records that no one else bothered to read. The derelict was a natural psionic null zone. It absorbed all amplified signals. It was a place where every broadcast died, where every connection went silent. A sanctuary. She commandeered a Keth skiprunner from the emergency dock, a small, sleek vessel with empty holds designed for fast cargo. The pilot tried to argue. She showed him the burned-out amplifier core and the three shadows still recovering in the medical bay. He stopped arguing. Grell collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, his breath ragged. Elara's fingers flew across the console, plotting a desperate course. The coordinates were burned into her memory. The derelict hung in a dead system, a ghost orbiting a dead star. It would take 12 hours at full burn. The engines hummed to life. The skiprunner detached from the station and began to accelerate. Behind them, a Darkweave pursuit vessel slid out of the shadows. It was a smooth, angular thing, blacker than the void around it, its surface drinking light instead of reflecting it. It did not have weapons that Elara could see. It did not need them. The Darkweave were the weapons. She pushed the throttle forward. The skiprunner groaned. Grell stared at the sensor display. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "They are faster. They are always faster." Elara did not answer. She was already running calculations in her head, running trajectories and fuel ratios and the cold, hard math of survival. The pursuit vessel would catch them in 3 hours, maybe 4 if she was lucky. Not enough, not nearly enough. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the worn data chip, the one she had shown to the technician before everything went wrong. It was old, ancient really. The casing was cracked, the surface scarred by decades of handling. It had belonged to a broker named Solen, a woman who had vanished 30 years ago in the Outer Rim. Solen had been the first human to map the null entity derelict. She had spent 6 months inside its silent hull, charting its corridors and cataloging its systems. She had called it a tomb. She had called it a fortress. She had called it the only place in the galaxy where a mind could be truly alone. And she had left behind a single note buried in the data, a single line that had haunted Elara since she first read it. "The dark is not empty, it is waiting." Grell looked at the chip, then at her face. "What is that?" "A key," she said. "Or a warning, I have not figured out which yet." The pursuit vessel grew larger on the sensors. It was closing faster than she had predicted. 2 hours now, maybe less. Elara plugged the chip into the skiprunner's console. The data began to stream, lines of old text and archaic schematics filling the display. She scanned through them, her eyes moving faster than her brain could fully process. She was looking for something specific. A way in, a back door, a weakness. The derelict was a null entity vessel, one of the last of its kind. The null entities had been a race of silent observers, beings that existed in the spaces between thought. They had no language, no culture, no desire to communicate. They simply watched. And then one day they had vanished. Their ships had been left behind, drifting through the void like abandoned temples. This particular vessel was massive. Its hull was composed of a material that absorbed all forms of energy, including psionic waves. The interior was a labyrinth of empty chambers and dead conduits. There was no gravity, no atmosphere, no life support of any kind. But there was a core. Solen had found it, A single spherical room at the exact center of the ship, shielded by layers of the same absorbing material. The room was small, barely large enough for one person, and it was completely, utterly silent. She called it the still point. Elara read the note again. The dark is not empty, it is waiting. She did not know what it meant, but she knew that the still point was her only destination. If she could reach it, she might be able to hide, to wait, to survive. The pursuit vessel was 1 hour behind. Grell gripped the armrest of his seat, his claws digging into the metal. "Elara," he said, his voice strained, "what happens when we get there?" She looked at him. His face was a mask of fear and hope, two emotions that did not sit well on a Keth. His silicate plates were cracked in a dozen places, stress fractures from the last few hours. He was a merchant, a trader, not a soldier. She did not have a good answer for him. "We find out," she said. "That is all I have." The skiprunner punched into the dead system, the star ahead of them a cold, red ember. The derelict appeared on the sensors, a massive, dark shape against the void. It was a skeleton, a ribcage of ancient metal and forgotten purpose. It hung in the blackness like a held breath. The pursuit vessel was 30 minutes behind. Elara did not slow down. She aimed the skiprunner directly at the derelict's main hangar bay, a gaping wound in the ship's hull. The data chip had provided the approach vector, a narrow corridor through the debris field that surrounded the vessel. She flew it perfectly, her hands steady, her eyes locked on the target. The hangar bay swallowed them. The skiprunner skidded across the deck, sparks flying from the landing gear. The moment the ship stopped, Elara was on her feet, grabbing the burnt-out amplifier core and the data chip. "Come on," she said. They ran into the dark. The silent Accord was a blade of obsidian and compressed starlight. Its hull was designed to slip between dimensions with the grace of a predator that had never known prey could fight back. Keth resided within its core, a consciousness woven into the ship's navigation lattice, feeling every tremor of the drive as it chewed through real space toward the derelict. The human's vessel was ahead, a pathetic Keth skiprunner spitting exhaust from overworked thrusters. It was absurd. Keth had calculated the chase 12 times. The skiprunner had a maximum acceleration of 3 Gs. The silent Accord could sustain 14. The human should have been caught, boarded, and neutralized within the first 8 minutes of the pursuit. Yet she had not been caught. She had instead piloted her dying ship through an asteroid field, using the debris as cover, scraping the hull against rocks that should have torn her apart. She had vented fuel to create a decoy cloud. She had even, and this was the part that Keth found most offensive, broadcast a fake distress signal on the Keth emergency frequency, knowing the silent Accord's sensors would automatically log it, knowing it would waste 3 seconds of processing time while the ship verified the forgery. 3 seconds? She had stolen 3 seconds from a Darkweave pursuit vessel. The madness was spreading. Keth could feel it in the whispers of the Free Systems communication buoys they passed. Reports were already circulating. A human broker, a Keth skiprunner, an attack on a Darkweave toll collector. The language used was speculative, excited, hungry. The Free System smelled chaos, and chaos meant opportunity. Keth had spent centuries building a reputation of cold, inevitable consequence. The human was dismantling it with a hammer made of broken psionic batteries and desperate improvisation. The silent Accord sensors finally painted the derelict on the main display. The null entity ship hung in the void like a scar on the fabric of space. It was jagged, asymmetrical, built from materials that did not reflect light so much as swallow it. The hull was the color of old bone, pitted with impact craters from millennia of drifting. Nebula gases curled around its edges, but they did not cling to it. They flowed around the vessel as if it were a stone in a stream, a place where physics itself hesitated to touch. Keth focused on the skiprunner. It was docking with the derelict, a tiny metal parasite attaching itself to a dead whale. The human was actually going inside. "Tractor beam," Keth ordered, its voice flat across the ship's internal network. "Lock onto the skiprunner, disable its engines." The silent Accord's forward array hummed. A beam of concentrated energy lanced out, a shimmering thread of altered space designed to grip matter and hold it still. The beam touched the skiprunner. The beam splintered. Keth felt the feedback surge through the ship systems. The tractor beam had not been blocked. It had been unraveled, its dimensional frequencies torn apart by the derelict's null field. The null entity vessel was not just a psionic dampener. It was a zone of absolute cancellation, a place where every technology that relied on dimensional manipulation simply ceased to function. The human had known. Of course she had known. She had chosen this specific derelict because its null field would neutralize the Silent Accord's primary weapons. Another improvisation, another perversion of logic. Kethal's thoughts flickered with something unfamiliar. It was not anger, not exactly. It was a cold, tight pressure in the center of its consciousness, a sensation it had not experienced in over a century. It was the feeling of being outmaneuvered by a species that still used combustion engines for primary propulsion. "Prepare a boarding party," Kethal said. The navigator, a lesser consciousness embedded in the ship's tactical systems, pulsed with confusion. "Kethal, we do not board, we harvest from range. That is our doctrine." "Our doctrine is being dismantled by a woman with a data chip and a broken amplifier," Kethal replied. "We will board, we will secure the human, we will end this farce." The navigator hesitated, then complied. 6 Darkweave forms materialized in the Silent Accord's boarding bay. They were tall, angular, their bodies composed of shadow-given weight, their faces featureless voids. Each carried an entropy projector, a weapon that fired a beam of accelerated decay. Organic matter touched by an entropy projector aged 1,000 years in a second. Metal turned to rust. Stone became sand. It was a weapon designed for ending things completely. They phased through the derelict's hull, their bodies shifting between dimensions to bypass the physical barrier. The null field tugged at them, pulling at their connection to the dark flow, but they were close to the source now. They had power enough to move. The airlock was ancient, its seals corroded, its mechanisms frozen. The Darkweave forced it open with a pulse of entropy, the metal crumbling like dried paper. They flooded into the central chamber. And there she stood. Elara Vant was a small thing, soft and fragile, her skin pale in the dim light of the derelict's emergency systems. Her clothes were torn, her hair wild, her hands smudged with grease and dried blood. She looked like a creature that had been hunted through a dozen systems and had finally run out of places to hide. She was standing before a vast, dormant AI command core. The core was a pillar of black crystal, easily 20 meters tall, covered in grooves and ridges that pulsed with a faint, dying light. It was the brain of the null-entity ship, a relic of a species that had vanished before most of the current galactic powers had learned to use fire, and the human had jury-rigged her broken thought amplifier into the core's input port. Wires hung from the connection, sparking intermittently, a mess of human engineering that looked like it would fail at any moment. Kethal stepped forward, its form solidifying in the chamber's center. Its voice resonated through the air, not as sound, but as pressure against the minds of everyone present. "You have nowhere to go, human. Your ship is docked. Your allies are broken. Your weapon is a child's toy connected to a dead machine." Elara Vant looked up. Her eyes were tired, but they held a light that Kethal did not like. "You wanted a transaction," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Here it is." Kethal paused. The human was negotiating. Even now, surrounded by 6 entropy projectors, she was trying to negotiate. "You value clean data streams," she continued. "You value efficiency, you value control. This core can silence your signals across this entire sector. If I trigger it, your trade routes die. You get nothing." Kethal scoffed, the sensation rippling through the chamber like a cold wind. "The core is dead, human. You are standing before a corpse. Your threats are hollow." Elara Vant smiled. It was a grim thing, ancient and knowing, a smile that had seen empires fall and had outlived them all. She placed her hands on the core. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Kethal felt a surge of something, energy, will, madness flow from the human into the dead machine. Elara Vant was not powering the core with technology. She was using her own chaotic human mind as a catalyst, pouring every ounce of her will, her fear, her stubborn, creative insanity into the ancient crystal. And deep within the core, something stirred. Lights flickered along the pillar's surface. The grooves began to glow with a soft, amber light. The air in the chamber grew heavy, thick with a pressure that was not physical. The null field began to expand, not just absorbing psionic energy, but amplifying it, pushing outward in waves that Kethal could feel in its very essence. Kethal, for the first time in centuries, felt true fear. This was not a weapon, this was a key. And the human was turning it in the lock. The chamber thrummed, not with the familiar hum of engines or the pulse of active systems, but with something older, something that vibrated in the bones rather than the air. Elara Vant stood at the center of the derelict's control room, her hand pressed against a console that felt warm, almost alive, beneath her palm. The AI core was waking. She had plugged the data chip into the only slot that fit, a port that had been waiting for centuries, its design matching the worn symbols on the ancient memory wafer. The console had recognized the data immediately, not as a command, not as a key, but as a greeting. A recursive pattern, a loop of self-reference that only a human consciousness could generate. The core had been dormant because no species in the galaxy thought to say hello in a way that meant, I know I am here. Elara's nose began to bleed. The thrumming peaked and then collapsed into silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of nothing. A sphere of absolute psionic emptiness expanded from the derelict's hull, pushing outward like a ripple in still water. The 6 Darkweave boarders froze mid-step, their shadowy forms suddenly solid, suddenly trapped in a reality that had no room for their kind of existence. They screamed, not with voices but with the silent thrashing of minds severed from the dark flow. Their bodies, once fluid and insubstantial, became heavy, awkward, bound by physics they had forgotten. One of them collapsed to the deck, its form flickering like a dying candle. The chamber's main display flickered to life. Kethal's projection wavered, its edges fraying as the null field gnawed at the signal. For the first time, the Darkweave consciousness looked uncertain. Its voice crackled through the speakers, thin and strained. Kethal demanded to know what she had done. Elara wiped the blood from her upper lip with the back of her hand. She could feel the core pressing against her thoughts, a vast and patient intelligence waiting for instruction. Her mind felt scraped raw, like a wound exposed to open air, but she held herself upright. She met the wavering projection's gaze. She said the offer still stands, her voice hoarse and ragged. Withdraw the tolls from Keth space. Grant the Keth free passage through all Darkweave trade routes. In return, she said, we deactivate the core. You keep your dark flow. Your network remains intact. Kethal's form flickered violently. The projection's voice carried a tone of disbelief, a rare crack in its usual composure. It called the demand absurd. It said the Keth were a resource, not a partner. Elara shook her head slowly. She told Kethal that the alternative was a dead zone that grows, sector by sector, as we teach others how to wake the old silence. She gestured at the console, at the ancient symbols carved into its surface. She said the null entity derelict was not a ghost ship. It was a quarantine, a tomb for a technology that the previous owners deemed too dangerous to leave active, and humanity had built it. Kethal went silent. The projection stabilized, but only barely. Its voice, when it returned, was measured, cold, but carrying a new note, something that might have been fear. It asked if she was lying. Elara held up the data chip, still glowing faintly in her blood-stained fingers. She said her people had forgotten what they made, but the memory was still there, buried in old code and older instincts. She said the galaxy had labeled humans primitive because they had lost their history, but losing a thing did not mean it ceased to exist. She said the core was not a weapon. It was a governor, a limiter, a tool for enforcing a rule that the galaxy had long since broken, the rule that said no species should feed on the minds of others. Kethal's projection flickered. It asked what she wanted. Elara repeated the terms, withdraw the tolls. Grant the Keth passage. She said the deal was simple and the cost was fixed. Kethal calculated. The silence stretched for an eternity, the only sound the ragged breathing of Elara and the panicked, fading whispers of the Darkweave boarders trapped in their solid bodies. Then the projection steadied. Kethal spoke with the tone of a merchant accepting a painful but necessary price. It said the terms were acceptable. It said the Darkweave would withdraw. Elara did not smile. She simply nodded and turned to the console. She pressed the sequence that Solen had encoded into the chip, a shutdown command that required 3 separate confirmations. The core pulsed once, a final acknowledgement, and then fell dormant. The sphere of silence collapsed. The Darkweave boarders gasped, their forms liquefying, slipping back into the shadows they had emerged from. They fled without a word, without a glance, dissolving into the darkness of the derelict's corridors. Kethal's projection began to fade. It said the human was dangerous. It said she had changed the terms of engagement. It said that was not a compliment, but it was not an insult either. The display went dark. Elara stood alone in the chamber, her hands shaking, her knees threatening to buckle. She turned away from the console and took 2 steps before her legs gave out. She collapsed to the deck, her forehead pressing against the cold metal floor. The thrumming was gone. The pressure in her skull was gone. All that remained was a hollow, ringing emptiness and the taste of copper in her mouth. Footsteps, Grell's silicate-plated hands found her shoulders, helped her turn over, helped her sit up. His face was a mask of concern, his dark eyes wide. He asked if she was alive. Elara let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She said she thought so, but she was not sure yet. Grell helped her to her feet. He said the Darkweave ships were pulling back. He said the Keth were safe. He said she had done what no one thought possible. Elara leaned against him, her legs unsteady. She said she did not do it alone. She said Solen had walked this path first, a century ago, and left the map behind. Grell said nothing. He simply guided her toward the dock, toward the skip runner, toward the long trip back to the crossroads. Weeks later, the crossroads station looked the same. The same neon glow, the same haze of smoke and steam, the same cacophony of 100 species shouting over each other in a dozen languages. But Elara Vant felt the difference in the air. The whispers followed her now. She sat at a table in a quiet corner of a Spoorweindrun cafe, a cup of something warm and bitter in her hands. The Keth had paid their fee. The Darkweave had withdrawn. The trade routes were open. But that was not why the whispers had started. It was because she had won. She was the broker who had stared into the void and made it blink first. The being who had traded with shadows and walked away with her soul intact. The one who had broken the rules of the galactic game and rewritten them on her own terms. The whispers called her many things: the ghost dealer, the null tongue, the woman who ate darkness. She did not care for any of them. A Spoorwein delegate approached her table, its mycelial tendrils weaving through the air. It carried a data slate, its surface covered in ancient symbols. It asked if she had a moment. Elara set down her cup. She said she always had a moment for a client. The delegate projected an image onto the table. A series of carvings, geometric and precise, their meaning lost to time. It asked if she recognized them. Elara studied the image. Her heart did not race. Her hands did not tremble. She had been expecting this, hoping for it, dreading it in equal measure. She said she did. The delegate's tendrils curled in surprise. It asked what they were. Elara reached into her jacket and pulled out her own data slate. She tapped the screen, projecting a matching set of symbols from her private archive. The same lines, the same curves, the same impossible precision. She said they were a language, a programming language, one that predated every species in the known galaxy. The delegate leaned closer. It asked what the language was for. Elara looked at the symbols, at the familiar shapes that had haunted her since she first found Solen's chip. She understood now what the galaxy was just beginning to realize. Humanity was not primitive, it was amnesiac. She said the language was a tool for changing the rules of reality itself. She said the null entity core was not the only one of its kind. She said there were more, dormant, waiting, scattered across the galaxy like seeds in dry soil. The delegate's tendrils went still. It asked if she was offering to find them. Elara smiled, not a warm smile, not a triumphant smile, a broker's smile, the smile of someone who had just discovered the ultimate product. She said she was not offering to find them. She said she was offering to interpret them. She said the difference was important. The delegate considered this. It asked what the price would be. Elara did not answer immediately. She looked past the delegate, past the cafe's glowing windows, out into the crowded chaos of the crossroads. She saw the Keth merchants walking freely, their heads held high. She saw the Darkweave agents keeping their distance, their eyes tracking her every move. She saw the paradox flicker at the edge of her vision, watching from a timeline that had not yet decided if she was a threat or an asset. She turned back to the delegate and said the price was simple. The truth, for everyone. No monopolies, no hoarding, no species claiming ownership of the past. The delegate's tendrils quivered. It said that was dangerous. Elara said it was. She stood up, leaving the bitter drink untouched. She said she would be opening a new channel, not to one client, but to the curious, the desperate, and the wise. She said anyone who wanted to understand the old symbols could come to her. She said the only requirement was that they share what they learned. The delegate asked if she was sure. Elara walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. She looked back at the delegate, at the image of the ancient language still glowing on the table. She said she had spent 23 years brokering deals between species who saw each other as resources. She said she was tired of it. She said it was time to broker something different. She stepped out into the neon-lit corridor, into the noise and the heat and the endless motion of the crossroads. The whispers followed her, louder now, carrying her new name. The Waker of Silent Things. She did not look back,